A deadly prairie fire surges across Kansas, unstoppable and faster than any rider can outrun. Alone in the open grasslands, a young frontierman faces the inferno with nothing but soaked buffalo grass and a survival trick almost no one believes works. The wind shifts, the heat tightens, and every second becomes a wager against nature's fiercest force. But in the heart of this blaze, he'll attempt a maneuver that could either save his life or vanish him in the fire's roar forever. A late summer haze hung over the Kansas prairie as the afternoon sun pressed down with a weight that felt almost physical. Grass stood knee-high, bleached and brittle, each blade carrying the tension of weeks without rain. Humidity hovered under 30%, turning every gust into a dry breath across the land. In that exposed sweep of open country stood young frontier boy Elias Calder, a lean frontier boy scanning the horizon with a caution learned far too young, steadying himself against the restless wind. He had been gathering buffalo grass for the family's livestock only moments earlier, cutting clean bundles with a worn sickle and tying them with strips of rawhide. It was routine work, the kind every frontier child learned early in life, yet today carried a strange stillness that tightened around him. The wind, usually steady, began to pulse in uneven bursts, as if the prairie itself were drawing a nervous breath. Elias paused mid-motion, sensing a shift that prickled across the back of his neck before he even understood its cause. When the first hint of smoke brushed the distant sky, he didn't spot it immediately. Far-off haze was common on the plains, sometimes drifting from controlled burns maintained in the tradition of indigenous fire cycles that shaped the region for centuries. But within minutes, the smoke column thickened, rising in a straight, ominous pillar before bending sharply east under a hard southern push. Elias felt the change in the air as it hit his face, warm and insistent, hinting that whatever burned was moving with incredible speed. He turned fully toward the horizon, narrowing his eyes as a faint orange ripple began to flutter at the base of the smoke. At first, it looked like sunlight glancing off water, but the shimmer grew steadily, until the line of flame stretched across the prairie in a jagged horizon of fire. Frontier families understood that a blaze needed only dry fuel, open land, and wind. Today the plains offered all three. Elias sensed danger long before any plume of heat reached him, and the realization made him swallow hard. Animals sensed it too. A pair of meadowlarks burst upward from the grass, wings beating frantically as they fled north. A jackrabbit streaked past him in a dusty blur, abandoning caution for the straight-line sprint of panic. Even distant cattle began bunching tightly, their uneasy calls trembling across the wind. Elias had grown up trusting the instincts of the animals long before he ever trusted his own. Their urgency sharpened his awareness, confirming the silent message the prairie had been whispering for minutes. He dropped his bundle of cut grass and climbed the nearest rise, a modest swell in the land that offered enough vantage to understand what approached. From there, the view struck him cold. The fire line wasn't far away at all. It was barreling toward him with a force nothing on two legs could outrun, driven forward by 20 to 30-mile-per-hour winds that whipped unbroken across the plains. Elias's pulse thudded as he calculated how little time remained, maybe 6 to 8 minutes before the flame front swallowed his position. His first instinct was to run south, toward the broadest stretch of open country, but even from the rise he saw the flames beginning to arc. The bending fire line curved eastward as shifting winds sculpted its direction, threatening to pinch off the only natural escape path. Prairie fires were infamous for trapping travelers in sudden sweeps of heat, turning open grassland into a shifting maze of danger. Elias had heard adults warn about this pattern countless times. None of their warnings conveyed the terror of seeing it unfold alone. He forced himself to breathe slowly, reminding his panicked body that fear clouded judgment. Frontier survival always began with observation, terrain first, wind second, then fuel. He knelt, scanning the slope for anything he could use, his gaze settling on the buffalo grass he had cut earlier. He remembered an older cattleman once explaining how soaked grass could blunt radiant heat if used with precision, though Elias had never practiced the method himself. Still, in a land that offered no real shelter, even partial knowledge mattered. Doubt tugged at him as he weighed the idea. A bundle of wet grass seemed pitifully small against a wall of flame taller than a homestead roof, but the prairie held secrets outsiders rarely respected. Newcomers mocked wet grass shielding as superstition, calling it nothing more than frontier folklore. Yet those who had lived their entire lives on the plains trusted it when no other option remained. Elias knew enough to understand that survival sometimes depended on lessons passed quietly between generations. He retrieved his sickle and scanned the ground for the nearest seep, one of those subtle hollows where groundwater sometimes pooled beneath thin topsoil. The horizon had turned copper as smoke filtered the sunlight, draping the land in a false dusk that deepened every shadow. Heat shimmered across the grass in trembling waves, and the air carried a faint mineral sting. Elias felt the fire's pressure building behind him, the growing heat rolling across the prairie like an advancing tide. As he began moving along the rise toward a patch of greener grass, he kept glancing back, watching the fire line expand with terrifying purpose. Flames reached outward in horizontal tongues as if stretching to claim every blade of fuel in their path. Elias tightened his grip on the sickle, forcing himself to remain deliberate. Running blindly meant running into unknown hazards, and the prairie punished the careless without hesitation. He was preparing to descend toward the greener patch when something shifted in the tall stems a few yards ahead. The movement was slight, almost indistinguishable from the natural sway of the grass, yet different enough to catch his eye. It sat low to the ground, half hidden, its outline disrupted by the wind, but unmistakably out of place. Elias's pulse stumbled as the fire roared closer, realizing that whatever waited there would force a decision he could not avoid. At that moment, everything changed.
Long before settlers built fences, prairie fires ruled the plains with a rhythm older than memory. Every frontier family feared them, yet some understood their secrets through hard lessons and borrowed wisdom. Elias had never faced one alone until today, when nature's oldest force began shaping his fate. What he learned in the next moments would challenge both instinct and inheritance. For generations before homesteaders arrived, fire had been a deliberate and respected presence on the Kansas plains. Indigenous communities used controlled burns to shape grazing grounds, restore soil richness, and keep predators from creeping too close to seasonal camps. These fires carried purpose rather than chaos, and their movement across the grasslands followed patterns that those who lived with the land understood intimately. But the fire bearing down on Elias was not one of those measured, intentional ceremonies. This blaze was born of drought, wind, and a careless spark somewhere far to the west, now transformed into a force that consumed everything in its path with a single-minded hunger. Elias recalled the stories told around winter hearths, stories describing how fires once swept across these open prairies with such power that even the buffalo herds shifted their migratory paths to avoid the season of flame. Standing in the tall grass, he remembered these accounts not with childish fascination, but with a rising awareness that he was now living inside one. His eyes followed the shifting smoke column as it built upward and then folded beneath the wind, creating a sweeping arc that seemed to pull toward him as if pulled by an unseen hand. He estimated the wind speed by the tension in his shirt and the pace of ripples racing across the ground. 20 to 30 miles per hour, maybe more in sudden bursts. That was enough to turn dry grass into a fuse stretching clear across the horizon. He crouched low, feeling the ground as he had been taught,
The earth held heat already, warm from the relentless afternoon sun. The dryness told him why the fire moved so quickly. Every blade of grass had been converted into ready tinder. The prairie had become a continuous sheet of fuel with no natural breaks to slow the advance of flame. No rocky ridge, no riverbank, no thick forest, just the unbroken sea of grass that drew pioneers westward and now threatened to devour anyone caught unprepared. While Elias traced the fire's direction, his thoughts drifted back to warnings from seasoned cattlemen and older homesteaders. They spoke often of newcomers who arrived with Eastern assumptions, unaware that the plains required a different kind of respect. Among these newcomers lived Charles Pembroke, a recent arrival who dismissed frontier wisdom as mere superstition. Elias had overheard him mocking what he called laughably simple tricks used by old ranchers to defend against fire: wet grass shields, dirt smothering, and improvised fire breaks built in seconds. Pembroke had insisted that sophisticated Eastern methods would keep a homestead safer than instinctual prairie traditions. Elias had listened silently back then, unsure how to argue, but he felt the sting of those words now as the fire drew closer. The heat had become noticeable, a shimmering pulse that pressed against his skin even from a distance. Elias scanned the terrain around him, forcing his mind to work through fear. The land dipped gently to the north, forming a shallow basin that could slow the fire's descent on one side, but potentially funnel wind through the other. He weighed this information carefully, remembering how his father once mentioned that terrain could deceive the eye. A hollow that looked protective might channel heat more intensely than an open rise. Yet he had little choice. He needed shelter from radiant heat, even temporary.
He checked the time by instinct, measuring the fire's progression against the speed of the wind. Maybe 7 minutes remained, possibly less. He could see embers floating low across the prairie, carried by invisible currents that curled unpredictably. Those embers meant the fire's reach was already longer than its visible front. If he misjudged even slightly, he could be surrounded before he understood what had happened. What troubled him more than the flames themselves was the strange shift in animal behavior that continued to unfold around him. A distant herd of pronghorn moved in a tight column, something they did only when genuinely threatened. A hawk that had been circling moments ago now flew sharply east as if abandoning its claim on the sky. Even insects seemed to vanish, leaving an unnatural silence broken only by the hiss of wind dragging through the grass. The land behaved like a vast nervous system reacting to an incoming shock. Elias tightened his grip on the bundle of damp buffalo grass he had collected earlier. The moisture within it offered the faintest promise of protection, though he knew it was only effective if used with precision. Older frontiersmen often described the method as a way to buy seconds, not minutes, and only when terrain, timing, and moisture worked together. But seconds could mean survival. Elias rehearsed the technique in his head, piecing together fragments of advice he had overheard over the years. Press low, keep the wet grass layered thickest toward the fire, anchor your body behind the dampest section, avoid inhaling smoke directly. Move only when the flame front has already passed its peak intensity. All this would have sounded abstract any other day, but under the copper-tinted sky, it became his lifeline. He moved carefully toward the slight depression he had spotted earlier, examining how the grass bent there under the wind. The basin wasn't deep, but it might reduce the direct blast of heat when the fire arrived. However, entering it without a plan felt like stepping into a trap. He observed the slopes, searching for the direction that offered the greatest protection. He noted how the wind curled across the rim and how the grass inside remained slightly greener than the surrounding expanse, suggesting better moisture retention.
Perhaps that moisture could slow ignition if the fire reached this dip. As he edged closer, the copper light thickened, turning the prairie into a landscape suspended between day and night. The fire roared louder, though still distant, a sound like cracking timbers mixed with rushing air. Elias hesitated as he considered where best to prepare himself, unsure whether the basin would shelter him or expose him further. He had to commit soon, long before the fire arrived, yet every instinct pushed him to examine the land one more time. Just as he stepped forward, something in the tall grass ahead shifted again, more distinctly this time. It wasn't the random sway of wind or the darting flight of a field creature. It carried intention, a presence concealed within the golden stalks. Elias froze, heart hammering as the fire's reflection flickered across the movement. Whatever hid there was about to force him into a decision he could no longer delay. The prairie held its breath, and Elias knew the next moment would pull him deeper into a test he never imagined facing alone. Survival on the plains was never about strength. It depended on understanding how wind, heat, terrain, and timing formed a system that shifted by the second. Now Elias stood within a shallow prairie depression where every element of that system began tightening around him. One wrong step could magnify his danger instead of reducing it, and the fire approaching from the west was accelerating faster than he had calculated. Elias stepped carefully into the basin, studying the dip in the land as if it were a map of his remaining options. The depression was wider than it appeared from above, stretching roughly 60 feet from one rim to the other, with sides sloping gradually enough to offer shelter without trapping him completely. Its floor held grass that was noticeably greener, thicker, and cooler beneath his boots, which meant this hollow had held moisture longer than the surrounding prairie. That single detail mattered more than anything else he had discovered so far, because the fire's movement would shift dramatically once it reached this patch of heavier fuel. The flames might slow for only 3 or 4 seconds, but those seconds could become the breathing space he desperately needed. He knelt at the center of the basin, pressing his palm into the soil. It felt faintly damp just beneath the surface, not enough to halt a blaze, but enough to buy a moment's hesitation from the flames. Elias scraped a small patch aside with his fingers, revealing a darker layer of earth that confirmed a slight retention of groundwater. The realization steadied him, giving shape to a preliminary plan forming slowly in his mind. Radiant heat would still surge across the basin with violent intensity, but the wetter grass could help blunt some of it if he created a barrier quickly and correctly. The wind pulsed overhead, bending the tops of the surrounding grass in sweeping arcs that reminded him how little control he truly had. He listened to the gusts, trying to detect any shift in direction. The fire's approach had a rhythm now, rolling surges of pressure, followed by brief pockets of cooler air, each cycle shorter than the last. Elias sensed the blaze drawing closer like a moving wall that reshaped the landscape with every push of wind. He needed to act fast, but he forced himself to think with clarity instead of panic, remembering that fear often killed quicker than flame. He reached for the bundle of buffalo grass he had gathered before the fire emerged on the horizon. The stalks were coarse but pliable, holding moisture well when saturated. Elias removed his canteen, another lifeline, whose contents suddenly felt too light, and poured water into the thickest portion of the bundle until the grass darkened with absorption. He repeated the process until the bundle felt heavy with moisture, squeezing it gently to check saturation. A slow drip formed between his fingers, a reassuring sign that the grass held enough water to function as a heat shield for at least a short span of time. His pulse steadied slightly as the method began to take shape. Then he moved across the basin, searching for the nearest groundwater seep. These small pockets often existed where the prairie dipped just enough to collect invisible runoff. He spotted a patch where the grass grew taller than the rest, indicating a subtle rise of moisture beneath. Kneeling, he pressed the wet bundle into the seep, letting the naturally damp soil further saturate it. He rotated the bundle slowly, making sure its thickest parts absorbed as much moisture as possible. By the time he lifted it again, the grass felt denser, almost cold in his hands despite the heat radiating across the land.
Elias dragged the wet bundle toward a position near the basin's downwind edge, the one least exposed to the direct impact of the flames. This side offered slight protection from the wind's fiercest push, while still close enough to the basin's center to avoid trapping him in a low pocket of suffocating heat. He laid the grass in overlapping layers, building the beginnings of a protective shield. The method was simple in theory, but required careful placement, and Elias worked with a calm diligence born of necessity. He angled the first layer slightly uphill toward the incoming fire, then placed the next layer against it to reinforce the moisture-heavy barrier. He continued collecting additional handfuls of brass from the greener sections of the basin, using the sickle to trim the blades efficiently. He spread these across the growing shield, weaving them into the main bundle until it formed a thick, pad-like structure. Elias knew this wouldn't stop fire, but it could delay the transfer of radiant heat long enough for the flame front to pass. He would need to lie low behind the barrier, using his body weight to anchor the grass to the ground without smothering his own airflow. Every second of hesitation could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. As he worked, the sound of the fire intensified into a low, gathering roar. The sky above the basin grew darker, turning from copper to a smoldering red as the smoke column expanded. Embers glowed in the wind like distant sparks of iron, and a faint crackling reached his ears, sharper now than before. Elias felt the temperature rising around him, not yet unbearable, but shifting toward the threshold where breathing would soon grow more difficult. He pressed a damp cloth from his canteen over his mouth and nose, preparing for the incoming surge of ash and heat. He paused for a brief moment, steadying his breath as he studied the approaching horizon. The fire line had grown taller, stretching in jagged waves that rose and fell like molten ridges. Its progression seemed strangely alive, moving not just with wind, but with purpose, devouring every strip of dry fuel in its path. Elias tried not to focus on the enormity of it, reminding himself that survival depended only on understanding the few square feet where he stood. The prairie taught an unforgiving lesson. Control existed only within arm's reach. He added the final layers of wet grass, smoothing them across the top of the shield until the patch felt uniform beneath his hands. The structure was small but dense, its moisture-heavy fibers cool against his skin. A thin ribbon of wind curled across the basin, carrying with it the first true wave of heat. Elias felt it ripple over him, a warning that the fire had crossed the last distant barrier of land and was now approaching the basin's western rim. He crouched behind the shield, feeling the ground tremble subtly under the force of the oncoming blaze. His breath slowed as the world narrowed to the immediate space around him. The fire was nearly here, and everything he had done until now was only preparation. What mattered next was endurance. The wind shifted slightly, altering the fire's angle in a way that made Elias's heart twist with uncertainty. He watched as the flame line bent and curved, drawn toward the basin, as though the land itself funneled it inward. The fire crested the western rim, sending a burst of heat downward that washed across the basin with stunning force. Elias tensed, gripping the wet grass shield as the flames leaned into the dip. For a moment, the world around him blurred into shimmering waves of heat and ash. Then,
In the corner of his vision, he saw something he hadn't expected. The fire line beginning to bend unnaturally, pulled by a sudden shift in wind direction. The blaze wasn't just descending, it was turning straight toward him. In that instant, Elias understood the danger had changed shape, and the next moments would alter everything he thought he had prepared for. The fire shifted course like a living predator adjusting its hunt, bending toward the basin with a suddenness that made the air crackle. Elias felt the change before he fully saw it, a subtle pressure drop that squeezed the sky and pulled the wind into a new direction. He now stood not beside the fire's path, but squarely in the funnel, at the center of a giant torch being shaped by the power of the plains. The basin that seemed like shelter moments ago had become the hinge upon which the fire's new attack would swing. The roaring wall of flame traveled across the prairie with a terrible grace, its leading edge moving in long, sweeping arcs as gusts from the south and west collided unpredictably. Elias watched the fire line curve inward like a tightening jaw, the flames leaning down slope toward the basin with frightening speed. He had known the blaze was coming, but not like this. This was no longer a simple forward rush. The fire was redirecting its energy as if pulled by the landscape itself. A shifting pocket of wind along the basin's rim had created a corridor that pointed directly toward him, drawing heat and embers downward in thick, curling ribbons. The sensation reminded him of a storm forming overhead, the way pressure changed before lightning struck, except now the threat was earthbound and relentless. He crouched beside the wet grass shield he had built, feeling the rising heat seep into the basin like an invisible tide. His mouth felt dry, despite the damp cloth he held near his lips, and each breath carried the faint metallic edge of ash drifting ahead of the fire. The thick air reminded him that radiant heat traveled faster than flame and could overwhelm before the fire line reached him. Elias studied the smoke's movement, recognizing subtle curls in its flow that suggested the wind was not just shifting, but accelerating through the basin's low point. That meant the fire would drop faster, picking up momentum as it chased the current. He adjusted his position, moving slightly lower on the slope where the ground dipped an inch or two and offered marginal shelter from the direct line of heat. The wet grass barrier glistened faintly with moisture, but the surface steam rising from it warned him that the water within would evaporate quickly once the fire crested the rim. He pressed his palm against the thickest layer and felt its coolness rapidly diminishing. He regretted not having more time to soak additional grass, but time on the frontier never bent for fear or hesitation. It only moved forward, demanding action even when options narrowed to a single desperate choice. Elias tightened the cloth over his mouth, preparing for the surge of hot air that would soon rush through the basin. He recalled advice he had once overheard from an elderly rancher while helping mend a fence. Stay low, stay still, keep your weight against the ground so the heat rushes over you rather than lifting around you. He had not understood the physics then, but standing here now, he felt the truth in every word. Heat rose and wind moved above the surface first, so hugging the ground became a thin margin of survival when the fire's pressure wave arrived. The idea felt strange, trusting dirt and wet grass against something as immense as a prairie fire, yet this was the kind of logic the plains demanded. The fire line climbed the basin's western edge and hovered for a moment, rising like a cresting wave suspended in wind-driven tension. Elias heard the roar intensify into something louder and more layered, a sound that felt as if the air itself were being torn apart. The flames bent forward under the push of the gusts, stretching down slope in long orange arcs that flickered like molten curtains. The pressure dropped sharply around him, a sign that the fire was drawing oxygen toward itself in a massive pull. Elias braced, knowing the next seconds would be decisive. As the flames spilled over the rim, the basin transformed into a bowl of searing light. Heat punched through the air in a wave thick enough to feel on his skin even before the fire touched the grass above him. Elias pressed himself lower, gripping the wet grass shield and positioning it so that the dampest fibers faced the oncoming blaze. The radiant heat slammed into the basin floor, flashing steam from the shield in thin, wispy trails. Elias's heart pounded against the ground as he felt the entire landscape shudder beneath the impact of flame meeting terrain. Wind roared through the dip, carrying sparks and embers that landed on the grass only to extinguish against the damp soil. The basin filled with swirling ash that drifted like torn paper caught in a storm. Elias blinked against the stinging grit, keeping his face low, breathing shallow through the cloth. The air burned along the edges of his nostrils, but he forced his focus outward, listening to the rhythm of heat and wind as he tried to anticipate the fire's next move. He knew the flame front's worst moment would last only a handful of seconds, the period when radiant heat peaked before the fire passed overhead. Survival depended on enduring that brief but brutal window without panicking or moving too quickly. The flames reached the upper edge of the damp grass shield, curling downward and licking across the outermost layers. Elias felt the heat surge again, more intense than anything before, turning the basin into a furnace. His eyes watered from the brightness, but he kept his gaze trained on the shifting grass above him, watching how the flames responded to the pockets of moisture he had woven into the barrier. Steam continued rising in small bursts, each one giving him another few moments of protection. A sudden gust swept across the basin, pushing the flames sideways and creating a momentary shift that revealed a new and alarming detail. The fire line wasn't simply passing overhead, it was dipping, bending lower than expected as the wind curled into the hollow. The basin's shape funneled the blast downward, and Elias realized the depression was acting like a chimney laid on its side, drawing heat into its center rather than letting it slide over the top. Panic edged at the corners of his thoughts, but he forced himself to remain still, clinging to the ground and trusting the shield he had built.
The fire rolled across the basin's western edge in a continuous wave, its roar so loud that Elias felt it in his bones. Heat radiated through every inch of the space around him, turning the air thick and trembling. He sensed the flame front shifting once more, curving in an unnatural arc that suggested the wind had changed direction again, tightening the fire's path toward the ground rather than lifting it upward. In that shifting glow of heat and smoke, Elias saw the fire line twist unexpectedly, drawn deeper into the basin as if the land were pulling it inward. The wind, now swirling in a sharper angle, began to funnel through the dip with new intensity. The flames obeyed that pull, bending toward him in a tightening crescent. The realization struck him cold. The fire wasn't finished. It was turning back toward the center of the basin, reshaping its path into something far more dangerous than a single pass. The world around him dimmed in the storm of ash, and Elias understood that the fire still had another move left, a move he had not prepared for. Heat slammed into the basin like a sudden hammer, turning the air dense and roaring as the flame front collapsed over the rim. Elias felt the shock of it ripple through the ground, forcing him lower as the world above shimmered in a furnace-like glow. Every instinct screamed to move, to run, to find any escape from the overwhelming blast. But this was the moment that determined survival. If he misjudged even a single breath, the fire would swallow him before he could think again. The force of the heat wave rolled across the basin in pulses, each surge hotter than the one before, as though the fire were exhaling directly into the hollow. He recognized the transition instantly. The flame front had peaked, and radiant heat was now at its most powerful.
This was the point seasoned frontiersmen feared the most, when the fire's strength compressed into seconds that felt like minutes. He could feel the wet grass shield beneath him growing lighter as the steam vented from its fibers, signaling that the moisture within was rapidly evaporating. The grass needed to hold just long enough for the flames to move past, yet the blaze's unusual shift forced him to reconsider everything he thought he understood. He eased himself tighter behind the shield, grounding his weight to ensure the barrier didn't lift under the violent bursts of air swirling across the basin floor. The pressure hit with a brute swirl, pushing hot winds downward as the flames ricocheted off the western rim. Elias kept his face angled toward the earth, breathing through the damp cloth in shallow, controlled pulls. The air tasted of ash and minerals, sharper with each inhale, but maintaining a low posture allowed the worst of the heat to sail above him. He felt the earth tremble as pockets of dry grass ignited near the rim, their brief flashes of flame snuffed out almost instantly by the competing gusts within the dip. His eyes watered from the brightness, but he forced his gaze upward just enough to study the movement at the basin's edges. The fire ran along the upper ridge with frightening speed, but something about its flow signaled a shift in its momentum. The depression slowed the fire's forward surge, compressing its energy in a strange sideways motion that made flames bend against themselves. Elias understood that this meant he had a sliver of time, but that sliver was shrinking faster than the grass beneath him could steam. The shield's outer layers were drying quickly, and he knew he needed to reinforce his position before the worst of the heat pressed directly onto him. He scanned the basin floor, noticing how some patches of grass around him still held moisture, green blades spared from immediate ignition by the hollow's cooler soil. He reached out carefully, gathering the wettest tufts he could find and tucking them beneath the upper edge of the shield without lifting it too high. Each handful added another thin layer of protection. It wasn't enough to stop the fire, but it could delay the moment when the heat became unbearable. His movements were deliberate, quick, and silent, guided by the understanding that every adjustment had to be made before the heat sealed the air around him. The fire's roar intensified again, echoing through the basin like wind thrashing inside a cavern. Elias felt the temperature spike sharply, a signal that the fire had reached the crest directly above him. The heat hit like a physical blow, flattening the air and forcing him to dig his fingers into the earth to anchor himself against the force. He clenched his jaw to steady his breath, knowing that if he inhaled too quickly, the scorching air could overwhelm him. The damp cloth filtered the worst of it, but even through the fabric he felt his lungs tightening against the heat. The wet grass shield now steamed so fiercely that thin ribbons of vapor curled upward in frantic bursts. Elias watched the steam drift as it climbed, noticing its direction, straight toward the eastern edge of the basin. That movement revealed something critical. The wind angle had shifted again. The fire wasn't only sweeping across the western rim anymore. It was beginning to curl downward in a spiraling pattern, pulled by turbulent gusts created by the basin's own shape. The realization struck him with chilling clarity. The fire wasn't done. The main front might pass, but a secondary wave, driven by erratic wind tunnels, could sweep directly across the hollow if he didn't act quickly. He pressed his hand against the ground again, feeling the temperature of the soil beneath the shield. It was hot, but not yet unbearable. That meant he had a brief window to adjust the micro-fire break he had created earlier. He flattened more grass around himself, pressing it into the dirt to form a tighter boundary. The perimeter needed to stay low, compact, and moist enough to resist spot ignition when embers drifted. He worked methodically, shaping the grass into a ring that hugged the basin's natural contours. Each segment formed a patchwork of damp fibers meant to slow the fire's descent should the wind carry flames into the lower hollow. Above him, the fire pulsed again, in a sudden gust, accompanied by a sound that made his stomach tighten. It wasn't a roar of flame, but the eerie hush that sometimes accompanied a fire's internal shift, a strange pocket of silence inside the noise. Experienced frontiersmen called it the still moment, a brief pause when the fire inhaled before unleashing its next surge. Elias felt the air press downward, heavy with heat, and instinctively lowered his head even further, bracing for whatever came next. The silence shattered in an instant as the fire unleashed a violent burst that swept across the upper basin in a glaring wave. Elias felt the heat flood over the shield, burning brighter and hotter than anything before. The basin glowed with a fierce amber light, and for a moment he feared the fire would collapse entirely into the hollow. But the micro-fire break held firm, protected by the moisture-heavy grass and the cooler soil beneath. Then, through the swirling ash above him, Elias glimpsed something that made his stomach lurch. A thin, glowing line traced itself along the inner slope, not from the main blaze, but from a patch of grass he hadn't seen ignite. The fire wasn't descending uniformly. It was creeping sideways along a crack in the terrain, a hidden channel of fuel that had ignited quietly under the pressure of the wind. That thin line burned where no flame should have been.
Elias froze as the realization settled over him. The fire had found another path into the basin, one he had not considered, one that threatened to undermine his entire plan. The glowing line intensified, and Elias understood that this new ignition wasn't just a threat. It was a warning that the fire had one more surprise waiting, one that would force him to confront a choice he had not yet prepared for. Fires rarely move in straight lines on the open prairie. They bend, split, and sometimes fold back on themselves, as if pulled by hidden strings woven through the land. Elias now watched a second fire path twist into existence, a creeping glow crawling along the basin's inner slope in a direction no natural front should follow. Whatever he thought he understood about the fire, the plains had decided to teach him something far more unpredictable. The basin that had once offered him a fighting chance now felt like a breathing trap, reshaping the fire's behavior in ways he had never witnessed. The glowing line running along the inner slope wasn't part of the main flame front. It was an offshoot created by shifting winds, circulating drafts, and the tight compression of heat pooling inside the hollow. The faint glow brightened, feeding on a thin strip of dry grass tucked beneath the denser, greener blades. Elias realized the basin's moisture-rich floor had protected him, but the slopes, less hydrated and more exposed to hot air, had become kindling, pulled into ignition by a swirling combination of downdrafts. The fire was creating a small vortex here, a circular draft spinning embers in looping patterns like sparks caught inside a pot. The realization chilled him more than any gust of wind could. A fire whirl, even a small one, could alter the basin's microclimate drastically. These spiraling drafts could lift flames, tilt them sideways, or drag them unpredictably across the land. Elias took in the swirling smoke above him, noticing how it twisted in uneven strands rather than rising cleanly. The basin's shape was feeding the whirl's formation, trapping hot air and forcing it to rotate instead of escape upward. He had seconds, maybe a minute, before that spinning heat either died out or transformed into something far more dangerous. Elias pressed his palm against the damp soil again, grounding himself in the tangible reality beneath him. The earth remained warm, but still held a thin cushion of moisture. That moisture meant his shield would last a little longer, but he could no longer rely solely on that barrier. The growing glow on the slope signaled that the fire was finding new paths toward him. He needed to reinforce his position before the basin's swirling heat collapsed inward. He turned his focus towards strengthening the wet grass shield and sealing any gaps before the fire whirl could pull flames into the hollow.
He crawled toward the seep he had found earlier, careful not to lift his body too high into the rising heat. The air above him shimmered with pulsing waves, making even the grass appear distorted. He dipped his hands into the moist soil and pressed handfuls of the damp earth into the edges of his grass shield, creating a tighter seal. The dirt felt cool between his fingers, a welcome contrast to the scorching air pushing down through the basin. He worked methodically, reinforcing the lower side of the shield where the new fire path seemed likely to advance. As he shaped the damp earth into a compact barrier, he could hear the distant crackle of dry grass igniting along the ridge, feeding the swirling currents above. Elias paused to steady his breath, feeling the air around him thicken with the pressure of the incoming drafts. He remembered hearing about fire whirls from a seasoned herdsman who described them as the prairie's version of a tornado, small, quick, and often deadly. The man had explained that they formed when hot air rose rapidly and collided with cooler ground-level currents, creating a spinning column capable of lifting burning debris. Elias had dismissed the idea then, imagining it as something rare or exaggerated. But now, watching the thin strand of flame spiral along the slope with unnatural persistence, he understood how real and unpredictable such phenomena could be.
The glow intensified, feeding on the slope's drier patch of grass. Elias knew he had only a narrow window to act. He dragged another cluster of wet buffalo grass from the basin floor, soaking it again in the seep and layering it thicker over the vulnerable side of his shield. The increased moisture brought him additional protection, though he could feel the heat drying it quickly. He distributed the damp grass evenly, ensuring that the fibers overlapped to create a dense, heat-resistant mat. When he pressed his weight into it again, the shield felt sturdier, its coolness lingering with a slight heaviness that comforted him despite the danger surrounding him. The wind shifted abruptly, sending a rush of hot air spiraling across the basin floor. Elias watched as the small fire path along the slope flickered, bent sideways, and then grew slightly taller. The swirling draft tugged at the flames, pulling them inward in a circular pattern. The basin's natural curve shaped the wind into a funnel, causing the heat to spin rather than flow cleanly. Elias felt his heart race as the fire's path twisted in a way that suggested the beginnings of a more defined whirl. He pressed himself lower, ensuring his face stayed behind the damp cloth and the protective edge of his grass barrier. He sensed movement behind him, faint but distinct, like the shifting of something caught in the basin's far corner. At first he thought it might be a loose bundle of grass or a clump of dry stems stirred by the swirling air. But the sound carried rhythm, irregular, urgent, and unmistakably alive. His heartbeat quickened as he slowly turned his head, careful not to disturb the shield protecting him. In the smoky half-light, the shape became clearer, a trembling form hunched low against the ground, struggling to stay hidden within the tall grass near the basin's eastern slope. It took a moment for Elias to understand what he was seeing. The small body shivered with fear, its silhouette barely visible in the ash-filled air. It was an animal, trapped and terrified, caught in the fire's path just as he was. The realization struck him with a sudden, heavy jolt. The basin was not his refuge alone. Whatever creature had sought shelter here faced the same deadly chaos, and now its presence complicated his every decision. The fire whirl forming overhead could sweep the flames in any direction, and a panicked animal might either draw the fire closer or endanger him if it moved unpredictably. Yet he couldn't ignore it. The frontier demanded hard choices, but it also demanded a sense of responsibility for every living thing caught in nature's fury. Elias felt the weight of that truth as he watched the trembling shape struggle against the swirling heat. The sound came again, soft, strained, and unmistakably desperate. Elias understood that he now faced a moment far more complex than simple survival. The fire continued twisting above him, feeding on unstable winds, and the trembling creature behind him trembled in quiet terror.
The basin was tightening its grip on both of them, forcing a decision he was not ready to make. And the fire whirl was still growing. Courage on the frontier was rarely loud. It rose in quiet moments when a person faced two impossible choices with no witnesses and no promises. Elias now faced such a moment as the fire tightened around the basin and the trembling shape behind him finally revealed itself. Survival demanded stillness, but humanity demanded action, and the two forces pulled at him as fiercely as the wind swirling overhead. As the glowing line along the slope brightened, Elias turned fully toward the sound he had heard. A calf, small and gaunt, crouched near a worn strip of broken fencing, partially hidden in the grass. Its hide was dusted with ash, and its flanks trembled with each labored breath. The calf must have stumbled into the abandoned wire while fleeing the fire, tangling its hind leg and pinning itself in place. It had likely been separated from a herd earlier in the chaos, and now, trapped in this sinking basin, it faced a fate no creature deserved. The calf struggled again, but the wire tightened around its leg with each panicked movement. The sight struck Elias with an unexpected force, pulling him out of his narrow focus on self-preservation.
The basin vibrated with the deepening hum of the fire whirl forming overhead. The rotating column of heat was still small, more a twisted draft than a true vortex, but its presence destabilized the air and pulled the flames in unpredictable directions. Elias could feel the wind shifting erratically, twisting across the ground in brief, spiraling bursts. These swirling waves pushed embers low, making small pockets of grass ignite in places no flame should reach. The calf's breath came out in shallow bursts, each one punctuated by a frightened tremor. Its eyes glinted through the drifting haze, the instinctual plea unmistakable even across species. Elias felt the sharp tug between action and restraint. He knew leaving the calf meant focusing on his own survival, reducing the risk of drawing attention from the unstable currents forming inside the basin. Yet something deeper stirred within him, an impulse shaped by his upbringing on a land that demanded both resilience and compassion. His father had always emphasized responsibility toward the creatures that shared the frontier, even the most helpless ones. A settler's life was harsh, but their stewardship of the land and animals was a duty passed from generation to generation. The fire's intensity along the western rim lessened briefly, signaling that the main front was beginning to drift away, but the danger inside the basin heightened with each passing second. Elias knew he had to move before the vortex solidified. If he timed it correctly, he might reach the calf, free it, and return before the next surge of heat forced the swirling currents lower. If he mistimed it, the wind shift could draw flames into the hollow and cut them escape entirely. He steadied his breath, feeling the weight of the damp cloth against his face. The wet grass shield remained functional, though its moisture had diminished noticeably. He took one last glance at it, committing its position to memory. Then, pushing through his fear, he began crawling low across the basin floor, following the greenest patches of grass where the moisture still lingered. Each movement had to be deliberate. He couldn't risk rising too high, not when the fire whirl tugged at the air like an invisible hand. He stayed close to the earth, letting the cooler ground buffer the worst of the heat radiating overhead. The calf watched him approach, its breaths shallow and tremulous. Elias could see how tightly the wire wrapped around the animal's leg, cutting into the hide. The fencing looked old, likely a remnant from abandoned grazing lines laid down by a settler who had moved on years ago. The wire snaked through the grass in crooked coils, rusted into a near unbreakable grip. Elias reached for the belt knife he carried, dull from years of use, but sturdy enough to cut weakened strands. He positioned himself beside the calf, moving slowly to avoid startling it further. He placed one hand gently on its shoulder to steady it, then angled the knife under the tensioned wire. The metal resisted at first, stiffened by rust and tightened by the calf's trembling. Elias applied pressure carefully, sawing through the thinnest section without lifting his upper body into the swirling heat. Sweat pooled at the edges of his forehead, not from exertion, but from the oppressive warmth settling inside the basin.
The knife's blade finally bit through the outer coil, causing the wire to loosen just enough for Elias to adjust his grip. He cut again, working steadily until the final strand snapped free. The calf stumbled forward as the tension released, unsure of its footing. Elias steadied it, guiding its weight so it didn't fall onto the hot ground. The animal pressed itself instinctively against the damp soil patches, sensing that these areas offered the coolest refuge. He urged it gently toward the lower side of the basin, where the grass still held moisture and the ground dipped into a shallow cushion. The calf limped, but remained steady, keeping pace beside Elias as they moved away from the glowing slope. Above them, the swirling draft intensified momentarily, tugging flame fragments sideways in erratic patterns. Elias felt the wind pressure shift across his back, urging him to hurry. He guided the calf toward the downwind corner of the basin, where the terrain curled into a subtle pocket sheltered from the worst of the vortex. This pocket was small, but enough to protect the calf from the vortex's immediate pull. He positioned the animal there and pressed some remaining wet grass along the ground to create a cooler buffer beneath its hooves. The fire whistle overhead deepened suddenly, signaling another change in wind direction. Elias froze for a second, sensing the fire whirl's unstable momentum drawing flame toward the upper basin once more. The basin brightened with a rising glow, turning ash fragments into swirling flecks of gold suspended in the darkening air. Heat rippled in waves that made the ground tremble beneath him. He crawled quickly back toward his own shield, knowing the next wind shift would determine whether the fire collapses toward the center or disperses harmlessly into the east. Every step across the basin floor carried the risk of misjudging the fire's unpredictable breath. The calf bleated once behind him, a soft, uncertain sound that carried strangely through the swirling heat.
As Elias reached his shield and pressed himself back into position, he felt the basin's atmosphere shift again. The fire whirl began to collapse, folding inward on itself with the unstable energy of a dying storm. Flames tilted in a sudden, alarming angle, pulled toward the very spot he had just left. The moment stretched thin as the fire line's collapse decided its next direction, and Elias understood instantly. The basin was about to change again, in a way he could neither predict nor fully prepare for. The fire was choosing its next path, straight over open ground. When a prairie fire loses its rhythm, the land becomes a battlefield of shifting forces, wind against heat, flame against fuel, instinct against reason. Elias sensed this battle tightening as the fire whirl collapsed, sending stray embers twisting across the basin. The open ground beyond the hollow glowed with new danger, and he understood that his next move would require more than endurance. It would require turning the fire's own hunger against itself. The basin no longer offered reliable shelter. The flames had shifted too many times, responding to unstable air currents that carved unpredictable paths through the hollow. Elias felt exposed despite the wet grass shield, aware that the fire could dip once more or split into another unpredictable offshoot. The calf remained in the small sheltered pocket he had chosen, its breath steady but anxious. Elias could hear the faint tremors of its steps as it tried to sink deeper into the cooler soil. Helping the animal had complicated his situation, yet he felt no regret. Survival on the frontier had always been about more than staying alive. It was about preserving the fragile life around you, even when the land seemed intent on erasing it. The fire's new trajectory stretched across the open slope east of the basin. Elias watched as the flames drifted along this wider ridge, licking at the dry grass and moving with alarming steadiness. The wind here began to shift again, flattening the smoke nearer the ground and giving the fire a path that pushed it horizontally rather than upward. He recognized the danger immediately. If the flames reached the ridge, they would sweep across the open plain where neither he nor the calf had shelter.
The basin had been unpredictable, but open ground offered no protection at all. The only way to keep the fire away from their escape route was to alter its course before it spread further across the ridge. He forced himself to remember every fire strategy he had absorbed over the years, even the ones only spoken about in whispers around winter fires. One such tactic surfaced now, a counterburn, a controlled ignition that consumed the nearby fuel before the main fire arrived. The concept sounded reckless, and in most conditions it was. Yet when executed correctly, it created a buffer zone that starved the advancing blaze and redirected its path. Wet buffalo grass could be used to shape the counterburn, letting it ignite slowly and predictably, giving the fire nowhere to advance. Elias assessed the terrain with renewed urgency. The ground between the basin and the ridge was a narrow slope that dipped slightly before rising again. The lower dip held a modest band of greener grass where moisture clung to the soil, while the ridge held the driest fuel. If he laid a thin line of soaked grass at the crest of the slope and sparked a controlled burn aimed toward the main fire, the two flames could meet under conditions he shaped, not the unpredictable drafts that dominated the basin. The moisture in his soaked bundles would control the burn's speed, allowing it to crawl outward rather than explode upward. It was a gamble, but one aligned with the land's logic. He moved swiftly but deliberately, gathering the remaining wet grass he had prepared earlier. The fibers were still cool, though the outermost layers had begun to steam from the surrounding heat. He soaked additional handfuls in the seep until the bundle felt heavy again, then shaped the grass into a curved line just above the basin's rim. The curve was important. A straight line risked breaking under wind pressure, but a curve allowed the fire to spread in a controlled arc, feeding evenly and preventing unpredictable leaps. Elias pressed the wet grass firmly into the soil, ensuring it adhered to the ground rather than lifting in the swirling gusts.
He checked the wind direction again, holding his damp cloth loosely in his fingers to watch how it fluttered. The wind flowed from southwest to northeast, creating a path that would push the counterburn toward the advancing flames angled from the west. The air still carried unstable gusts, but the ridge was higher and more open than the basin, reducing the chance of another vortex. Elias studied the path again, tracing with his eyes the arc where small flames could crawl safely without endangering him or the calf. He knew the fire's hunger would pull the two blazes together once ignited, but he needed precise timing to prevent the counterburn from reversing direction. He lowered himself and angled his body between the wet grass and the open air, shielding it from the wind long enough to strike the spark. He used a small flint he carried in his pocket, striking it quickly to produce a short burst of bright sparks. The first spark fizzled, but the second caught on a thin edge of dried grass threaded into the wet bundle. Elias monitored the ignition closely, ensuring it spread slowly, creeping along the dampened fibers at a controlled pace. The fire grew with deliberate hesitation, as if testing its own strength, then advanced outward in a smooth, predictable wave. The counterburn began its journey up the slope, shaping itself to the curve Elias had created. Its movements were measured, controlled by the balance of moisture and wind that guided its path. Elias felt the heat intensify at his back as the controlled burn expanded, consuming the limited dry fuel he had placed deliberately in its path. The flames rose no higher than his shin, a manageable height that told him the moisture remained effective. He remained close, but not too close, watching the fire's rhythm with the focus of someone reading a shifting map. The main blaze along the ridge reacted almost immediately. The moment the counterburn's smoke rose into the air, the advancing fire line adjusted its angle, drawn toward the sudden vacuum of burnt fuel. Flames leaned inward, attracted by the lack of fresh grafts between the two fires.
The wind tugged at both fronts, accelerating their convergence. Elias stepped back, pulling farther into the basin as the merging path widened. He kept his eye on the calf, ensuring it remained sheltered in the pocket of cooler grass he had prepared. Then it happened. The two fires met in a brilliant clash of heat and pressure, creating a burst of swirling smoke that twisted upward like a rising column. The collision robbed the main fire of its fuel, smothering its forward surge and breaking its momentum. The flames crackled sharply, releasing a brief but powerful wave of heat that lifted into the air instead of sinking downward. The ridge glowed white for a moment, then dimmed as the fire consumed what little fuel remained between the two fronts. Yet the victory came with a silent warning. Elias felt the pressure wave shift through the basin, stirring ash and altering the wind's pull in ways he couldn't fully predict. The merged flames curled upward, reaching higher than either fire had alone. The rising heat shaped the air into a twisting column that began building in height, swirling with unstable momentum. The counterburn had worked, but it had also awakened something larger. The merged flame column was rising fast, and Elias realized he was standing closer to it than he had intended.
Fire meeting fire is never a quiet encounter. It twists the air, reshapes the sky, and bends the land under a force that feels both ancient and unrestrained. As the counterburn and the main fire collided, Elias felt the ground tremble beneath him, the prairie reacting like a living thing to the sudden shock. He had prepared for heat, wind, and smoke, but nothing prepared him for the chaos released when two flame fronts tried to devour each other. The merged flame column rose in a spiraling burst, fed by the last pockets of dry fuel trapped between the two fires. Elias watched the column twist upward, thick with ash and glowing embers that spun like molten seeds launched into the darkening sky. The collision had robbed the main blaze of its momentum, but it had also created an unstable updraft that churned violently, threatening to drag the fire back downward if the wind changed direction. The basin quivered beneath the pressure shift, its grass trembling as though bracing for another unpredictable surge. Elias instinctively ducked lower, pulling away from the edge just far enough to shield himself from the heat without losing sight of the ridge. The air pulsed around him in hot waves, each one carrying the scent of scorched earth mixed with the damp, earthy smell of his makeshift shield. The counterburn's controlled flames had burned quickly, leaving behind a charred stretch that now stood as a thin barrier between him and the advancing fire line. But the merging of two fires created energy that could behave in ways no person could fully anticipate. Elias watched closely as the rising column swayed, tugged by competing gusts that threatened to tilt it dangerously close to the basin. Even the calf sensed the instability. It shifted nervously in its sheltered pocket, letting out a soft, uncertain sound that shivered through the swirling heat. Elias pressed his weight against the ground, letting the cooler soil steady his senses. The sky above had taken on an eerie copper hue, darkened by smoke yet brightened by the glow of the merging flames. Embers drifted downward in slow arcs before curling upward again in the rising drafts, creating a dance of sparks that flickered across the basin like fireflies caught in a storm. Elias monitored each drift, watching for signs that a stray ember might ignite another hidden patch of dry grass. He knew the land well enough to understand that even the smallest ember could undo everything he had fought to create. The column swelled again, the heat folding upward in a sudden burst that made the air quiver. Elias could feel the shock waves slide across his back, sending a ripple through the grass around him. He couldn't tell whether the column was strengthening or collapsing. The swirling currents made it impossible to read. He remembered stories of towering fire plumes that rose hundreds of feet in the air, only to fall sideways when the wind cut sharply against their base. If that happened now, the flames could sweep across the basin with enough force to overwhelm both him and the calf before either had time to move. But something shifted.
The merged flames began to bend toward the east as the wind strengthened, pulling the fire line away from the basin with a slow but steady force. Elias watched as the flames lost their vertical reach, stretching horizontally across the ridge instead. The collapse of the columns sent a final wave of heat downwind, brushing the basin with one last burst of scorching air before drifting eastward. Elias ducked instinctively, but the heat passed over him with less intensity than he expected. The pressure eased, the roar softened, and for the first time since the fire appeared, the basin felt momentarily still. The silence that followed was heavy and disorienting. After the chaos of roaring flames, swirling ash, and unpredictable wind, the quiet felt almost unnatural. Elias raised his head slowly, scanning the ridge for any sign of lingering danger. The fire line continued to move east, weakened and stretched thin after colliding with the counterburn. The ground around the ridge glowed red in scattered patches, but the main surge had lost its force. Elias allowed himself a small breath of relief, though he remained cautious. Fires on the prairie often hid smaller dangers: a stray ember, a downwind spark, a hidden patch of unburned grass that could ignite under the slightest gust. The calf let out a soft bleat, bringing Elias's attention back to the basin. The animal had survived the worst of the heat, though its flanks still trembled with fear and exertion. Elias pushed himself upright, keeping low as he moved towards it. The ground floor felt different now, still warm but no longer suffocating. He could breathe easier, though the air still carried a heavy mixture of moisture, ash, and the faint metallic tang left behind by burned vegetation. He checked the calf's leg briefly, making sure the cut wire hadn't opened any deeper wound. The animal leaned lightly against him, drawing strength from the ground's cooling temperature.
Elias looked back toward the ridge, noting the fire's diminishing glow. A slow, steady breeze began pushing the smoke eastward, clearing the sky just enough to let the late afternoon sun break through the haze. The land revealed its scars in streaks of blackened grass, glowing embers, and smoldering patches that released thin trails of smoke. The contrast between charred earth and untouched green was stark, reminding him that survival on the prairie was often measured in inches rather than miles. As the heat receded, Elias rose slightly to survey the wider landscape. The fire had carved a long, jagged path across the plains, leaving behind a corridor of destruction that stretched farther than he could see. Yet the basin, despite its unpredictable danger, had preserved pockets of life. The wet grass patches remained intact, the seep still glistened faintly, and the calf now stood cautiously on steadier legs. The land had tested him, pushing him beyond the limits of what he had imagined possible, but he had learned to read its shifting signals and trust the small advantages it offered. He turned, scanning the horizon again, and froze. A figure emerged through the drifting smoke, walking slowly but deliberately toward the basin. At first, Elias couldn't make out the person's features, only the silhouette of a man carrying something long and wooden. As the figure drew closer, the outline became more familiar. The posture, the stride, the slight tilt of the shoulders. It was Charles Pembroke. The newcomer stood at the edge of the basin, his face smudged with soot, his clothes streaked with ash. He carried a scorched wooden pole, and something metallic glinted at its end. Elias couldn't yet tell what it was, but the man's exhausted expression and the weight of whatever he carried spoke volumes. Pembroke stepped forward, stopping at the rim of the basin as if gathering himself. And what he held in his hands was about to change everything Elias thought he knew about how the fire had started and how close it had come to taking far more than the prairie grass. Survival stories often end with relief, but frontier stories end with clarity, etched in ash, shaped by hard truth, and illuminated by the thin margin between judgment and luck. As Elias faced Charles Pembroke at the edge of the basin, the fading fire revealed more than scorched earth. It revealed the consequences of choices made long before the flames reached the prairie. What unfolded next would shift how Elias understood the land, the people who lived on it, and the forces that governed them both. Pembroke's silhouette wavered in the settling smoke, the scorched wooden pole he carried resting heavily in his grip. Elias rose slowly from the basin floor, guiding the calf beside him with a steady hand. The older homesteader's face was drawn and pale beneath streaks of soot, his clothes marked by crushed ash and splatters of dirt. He looked like someone who had run from disaster, not someone who had merely stumbled upon it. The object he held, a burned metal shovel, glinted with a dull orange tint, as though it had been exposed to extreme heat for too long. Its edges were warped, the handle blackened to near charcoal. Pembroke spoke quietly, his voice strained by smoke and exhaustion. He explained that when the first column of smoke rose far to the west, he had tried to fight the fire directly with crude bucket lines and rushed digging. He had believed he could carve a break around his homestead faster than the fire could advance. But the prairie did not bend to stubbornness or city-born logic. The heat overwhelmed him within minutes, forcing him to abandon the irrigation ditch he was desperate to complete. As he fled, he scavenged whatever tools he could carry and stumbled through drifting smoke until he reached the ridge, unaware that Elias had been fighting his own battle in the basin below.
Elias listened intently, noting how Pembroke's voice cracked when he admitted that he had underestimated the land's temperament. His attempt to impose rigid order on the frontier had returned only dangerous consequences. The wind had shifted repeatedly, whipping around the half-dug ditch and sending embers straight back toward the homestead. The shovel he carried told the rest of the story. Its warped blade and cracked handle bore witness to a frantic effort that nearly cost him his life. He confessed that the moment he realized the fire was too fast and too hungry for any Eastern method to counter, he had abandoned everything he believed he understood about fire. Yet Pembroke did not come to the basin seeking praise or pity. He came with acknowledgement, and overdue recognition of the knowledge that frontier families had gathered over generations. He looked at the wet grass shield, the micro-fire break, the counter-burn path now scorched into the ridge, and the surviving calf standing beside Elias. Quietly, he admitted that the very trick he had once mocked had saved the boy, the calf, and indirectly his own homestead. Elias felt no pride in Pembroke's admission, only an unexpected sense of calm. The frontier had a way of testing a person's beliefs, and those who learned from its lessons survived. The fire continued drifting eastward, leaving the sky streaked with muted gray and burnt gold. The prairie glowed in smoldering patches, steam rising from the damp soil where the basin had held moisture. Elias stepped onto more stable ground and helped Pembroke descend the slope, guiding him toward the small pocket where the calf waited. The animal nudged them both, exhausted but alive, its breathing still shallow but steady enough to reassure him. Together they stood at the basin's center, surveying the long black corridor carved into the land by the day's destruction. As the wind settled, Elias felt the weight of what he had endured shift into something more reflective. It wasn't triumph, nor was it lingering fear. It was a sharper understanding of how the land worked, how fire behaved, how moisture shaped terrain, how wind could either shelter or betray. Pembroke, too, seemed changed, humbled not just by survival, but by the realization that living on the frontier required cooperation with the land, not combat against it. Elias knelt near the damp soil and began gathering the few remaining unburned strands of buffalo grass. With Pembroke watching in quiet curiosity, he dragged the wet stalks into a neat pile and began forming a small demonstration of the technique he had used. Pembroke leaned closer, observing how the moisture-rich fibers insulated against heat, how they redirected radiant waves, and how the shield's placement mattered as much as its density.
Elias explained each step in a calm, measured tone, focusing on the practical details rather than recounting the fear or chaos he had experienced. The calf grazed weakly nearby, pausing occasionally to glance in their direction. The sky continued to brighten as smoke thinned, revealing streaks of deepening blue at the horizon. Elias felt the land breathing again, slowly, cautiously, but steadily. The basin had been unpredictable, yet it had provided the moisture and structure necessary for survival. Beyond its boundaries, the ridge revealed the aftermath of the counterburn, a curved line of blackened earth that had prevented the fire from sweeping into the open plains. Pembroke's attention shifted between the burned ridge and the orderly lines Elias arranged with the wet grass. He asked no questions, needing none. The evidence of what worked lay plainly across the land. Slowly he lowered himself onto a patch of cooled soil, letting his posture relax for the first time since the fire began. His expression carried fatigue, remorse, and a dawning respect for the frontier's strange logic. Elias sensed that Pembroke's perspective had shifted permanently. As the smoke lifted further, Elias stood and looked toward the horizon. The fire was now a distant threat, its glow fading beneath the weight of cooling air. In the silence that followed, he felt a deep clarity settle within him, one shaped by trust in the land, humility before its forces, and a sharpened sense of responsibility. He understood that enduring the fire was only part of the lesson. The true understanding came in recognizing how every element, wind, soil, grass, terrain, worked together long before a person ever set foot on the prairie. Standing side by side, Elias and Pembroke watched the last trail of smoke drift east. The prairie lay scarred but alive, its resilience etched in the remaining patches of green and the surviving moisture held in the ground. Even the calf lifted its head toward the breeze, sensing that danger had passed. But frontier peace rarely lasted long. The land moved in cycles, fire, storm, drought, wind, each shaping the lives of those who braved it. Elias knew that this day's trial would not be the last. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunderclouds gathered on the horizon, signaling the arrival of a new season whose storms would test the plains in a very different way. And in the next great storm, the frontier would confront a threat far more unpredictable than fire.
The prairie fire left behind a trail of ash, but also a deeper understanding etched into Elias's memory. He learned that survival was never about strength alone, but about reading the land and respecting the forces older than any settler's tools. As the smoke drifted east, the basin stood as quiet proof that knowledge and instinct could outmatch even the fiercest blaze. And though the frontier would test him again, Elias now carried the confidence of someone who had faced the fire and learned from it. If stories of real frontier grit still spark something in you, don't keep this one to yourself. Pass it along to someone who loves true American wilderness history. And if you want to keep stepping into the kinds of forgotten survival legends most folks never hear about, stick with this channel and let the next journey find you. Every new episode builds on the last, drawing you deeper into the untold heart of the frontier. The trail ahead gets even more intense from here.